The Race, Health and Happiness podcast is brought to you through the generous sponsorship of United Way Greater Toronto, with help from University X, the school formerly known as Ryerson, and with support from subscribers and listeners like you. Donate today at patreon.com/racehealthhappy. We appreciate your support.
It's not enough to just survive in this racialized world. We are learning together to thrive. This is Race, Health, and Happiness, and I'm your host, Dr. O. My guest today is Camille Dundas, editor-in-chief of Canada's largest Black online magazine, the award-winning ByBlacks.com. You should definitely check it out. Camille is also widely sought after as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Her educational sessions are anchored in a historical understanding of systemic racism and how that has impacted today's corporate culture. And her delivery is deeply rooted in her own lived experience as a Black woman in the workplace. Camille, welcome to Race, Health, and Happiness.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So we're going to talk about a number of different things, but I always like to start off by asking my guests, what is your superpower?
Well, growing up, I really wished I could fly. But ruling that out, I think that my superpower, I've had it since I was a little kid, and that is absolutely in storytelling. I've been told that I've been telling stories since I could talk, and I would regale all our family members at any chance I could get with very long, complex stories. And I've used that as I've grown up in order to connect with people. And I've layered on an aspect of radical transparency, of radical truth telling. It took me a while to get to that point, I will tell you. But my ability to connect with people through storytelling, to explain complex ideas through simple storytelling is a real superpower that I really enjoy.
I love that. And from what I've heard, actually, it sounds like it was a little bit of your mom's superpower too. So it looks like it's an inherited, transgenerational superpower. Am I wrong? Am I right?
Oh, you're on the spot with that. First, my grandmother is Mabel Moyer James, and she was the first female minister of government in the Caribbean. So she was Minister of Home Affairs in Dominica, where my mom is from. And so she was a firecracker, as you can imagine, being the only woman in government during this is 40s, 50s we're talking about. She was a renegade. And even into her old age, she was just so forceful. And listening to her speak, well, you couldn't help but be inspired. My mom was a different kind of force, a quieter force, but a force of with passion for educating. And so I grew up watching her educate people about health. She was really passionate about health. She was the executive director of the St. Lucia Cancer Society. St. Lucia is where I grew up for the latter half of my childhood. And I watched her doing media interviews. She was known as that cancer lady growing up. And she would do, of course, growing up in the Caribbean, it's a very conservative society. But when it comes to health, you can't be conservative when you're talking about, especially sexual health, which is a lot of what she spoke about. So she would go out into the communities and do those, your typical like cucumber and condom type education sessions to educate people about sexual health, which is something that is so not talked about in the Caribbean, to people's detriment, to people's death. Right. And she was really passionate about getting people to understand those things. And so I watched her do that. So I absolutely inherited, I think, that love of speaking and educating the public.
No, I love that. I love how you just kind of show how it passed from generation to generation. Again, thinking about like a superpower, it's almost like a movie in and of itself. But let's dive into your upbringing a little bit because yes, you kind of
Yeah.
danced between North America and the Caribbean. I'm always
Hmm.
fascinated because I grew up in Montreal, right? So I grew up kind
Hmm.
of like in a context where I was racialized from, a very went through
Hmm.
the process of being labeled Black at a very young age. You have to
Yes.
kind of navigate that
Yeah.
at 6 years old. And I haven't had the experience of living in a community where, the Black population is the dominant group.
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
spent quite a bit of your youth in the Caribbean. And so how do you think that shaped your opportunities or sense of
Hmm.
self as a Black woman?
Hmm. Massive. At first, so the quick summary is that I was born in Trinidad. There was a recession happening in Trinidad, and then my parents came to Canada, and we actually landed in Montreal first. And so we went from Montreal and then to Toronto, and I stayed there from age 4 till 12. Now, when my dad announced that we were moving to St. Lucia, we put together like a protest sheet, like, we, like, my brothers and my sister and I, we put together like all the reasons why this is not good for us. And it was like the worst ignorant reasons you can think of. This is like 12-year-old me being like, literally, you're taking me to a third world country. Like, I won't even have this. I want, like, just the most like 12-year-old ignorant things you can think of. At that point in my life, I was completely Canadianized, right? Like, I had never even been back to the Caribbean for vacation, right? And so I was all like, this is where I belong. Like, I'm Canadian. Like, why are you taking me there? This is a punishment. It's so very interesting when you mention the word opportunities, because I strongly believe that the opportunities I got while living in St. Lucia, I would not have gotten in Canada. And for starting with the quality of education I was afforded, I was in, a public yet sort of private school, a convent school. So it was run by nuns. It was a very high standard of expectation there. And while there was a lot of toxicity involved in that type of environment,
I can
I will
imagine,
say that,
but yeah.
there was also a lot of good too. In terms of the work ethic that I grew to embody was completely from that environment because the expectations were so high. Whereas in Canada, I never felt that anybody expected anything great of me at school in any way, right? And I never felt that I had to live up to anything. I never felt there was anything to reach for. I never felt that growing up.
Pause. Studies across North America have demonstrated time and time again that Black youth experience discrimination in the classroom. They experience what's called hypervisibility, which means compared to their white peers, if they do something wrong, it is noticed immediately and punished more severely. But on the flip side, they also experience invisibility. So if they are a high achieving student, their accomplishments are more likely to be ignored. So what's the antidote to racism in schools? That remains to be seen. But there are Black advocacy groups and allies in the US, the UK, and in Canada pushing for things like Black history to be taught in schools, pushing for anti-racism training for teachers, and advocating for the establishment of Afrocentric schools that are created for and by Black people.
I never felt that I had to live up to anything. I never felt there was anything to reach for. I never felt that growing up. But whereas in St. Lucia, there was this expectation that you are among greatness. You are walking among greatness. You should be grateful to be here and don't waste your opportunities. So there was a lot of messaging around that, right? And the discipline, again, while toxic on one hand, was good for me on the other hand, in terms of what I needed. I had the opportunity to flourish in the creative arts where I was passionate. Every single year I got to write a play for the school. I got to perform it. We did elocution, we did spoken word, we did singing.
And if I recall correctly, because yes, you're among greatness, but I think your superpowers and your greatness was also recognized during that time because you had the opportunity to perform poetry for Nelson
Yeah,
Mandela.
I
Is that
was
right?
I was just going to say that because what that led to was that opportunity. My principal, I was 17 at the time, and my principal came to me and said, "Nelson Mandela is coming to St. Lucia, and the school children, all of the schools are coming together to do a whole show, like a whole presentation, and we want you to do an ode to his life, to do a poem." And so I wrote this very long poem and performed it with three of my other friends in front of Mr. Mandela, and then got to meet him and present the poem to him in a plaque. And that was one of the most special moments of my whole life. And I can't imagine having that opportunity while growing up in Toronto.
Yeah, no, I'm getting goosebumps. I can't imagine being a 17-year-old girl and having the opportunity to perform for and then spend a moment with, like,
Hmm.
in the flesh, in person with
Yes.
Nelson
Yeah.
Mandela. That is fantastic. And quite right. It would be a giant leap to think about how that would happen in Canada, given our context. As much as you had all of that greatness within you. It's it being recognized, right, within
Hmm.
our
Hmm.
context in the classroom. So so then coming from that context, right, where you were given opportunities to shine, where you were seen as a person, a full person, and your gifts recognized. And then coming to Canada. When did you come back to Canada?
So I came back to Canada when I was 21 to go to journalism school at Carleton U.
Okay, okay, okay. So you studied journalism in your early 20s, and then my understanding is you got a job at a leading, we don't have to say the name, but a leading media organization, but only to find out that you were hired as a diversity hire. Is that right? Can you share that experience with it? Like you're out of
Yeah.
school, maybe you've worked a little bit,
Oh,
but now you get this opportunity. What happened?
when I graduated, I was so excited to get what I felt was my dream job at the time. To get a job at a big broadcaster right out of school is a huge deal. So I was really proud of myself. And I started on the job. It was like a 1 year contract with 6 months in radio and the other 6 months in TV. I started in TV, where was my love. And it was not what I expected in terms of, I knew it was going to be difficult, but that wasn't the problem. The work wasn't the problem. I was a natural at the work. It was everything else around it. And it was trying to decode what people meant when they said certain things, such as, "Oh, you're here because of that program, right?" And I would be confused because I'm like, "Well, do they mean like my university program or like my like what are they talking about?" And I was it was very confusing. Saying things like, "Oh, whatever, you don't need to work on that because you won't be here next year." Um or being in a story meeting and sitting around and listening to a senior white journalist pitch a story and characterize the people in the story who happen to be black as completely criminal before we even get to the bottom of a story. Um, and looking around thinking, is anyone going to say anything? And realizing, oh no, no one's saying anything. So you can't say anything either. You're new. You don't say anything. And to have my story pitches given to like a an intern who happens to be white and male, but who's kind of like one rung below me, to have stories that I pitch kind of assigned to them instead of me.
They're given the
You
opportunity
just
instead of you.
correct,
Hmm.
correct. And to see you making mistakes, which is natural, being vilified for them, but they make a mistake and they're comforted and they're given another
There's
chance.
empathy, there's understanding when it's
Lots of it,
yes, but not
lots
for
of
us.
it.
Hmm.
And so I honestly did not have a, a racial lens of the world at that time. I got to be honest with you. I didn't, it never occurred to me that any of these things were due to race or racism. And I remember the way that I found out, it was just by accident, because I was on going to a training program, and in Ottawa, and I was happened to be on a flight with one of the facilitators, and just making small talk. I said, "Oh, who else is coming?" And she had this notebook which she flipped open that had names next to him, and she was going through it, and next to my name had this acronym next to my name. But I was sort of too embarrassed to ask her what that was. And so when I got back to the hotel, I went on our internal website and looked up the acronym. And that's when I realized I was a diversity hire. And so I was hit with all types of emotions like, do I not deserve this job? Is that why people are speaking to me this way? Is it, was I the best person, or was I just the best Black person? Mind you, I was the only Black person in my graduating year of journalism. And, it was this program, they go to the schools and they say, look, give us your best, the cream of the crop, like who are racialized, I suppose. And then I remember, my professor being like, hey, there's this great opportunity. Like, she didn't tell me like exactly what it was. And then I think they all just assumed that I knew, because I went to HR afterwards and I said, look, what is this? And she said, I'm so sorry. I just assumed that you knew. Like, I thought this is a program we have running every year. And I was like, oh, okay. And she was very apologetic. Amazing woman. But that was the situation. Having me now questioning everything about myself. There was one Black lecturer who happened to work there, and I in a different unit. And I went upstairs to find him. And I said, listen, here, and I'm in a puddle of tears. And I'm like, this is what I just found out. What should I do? How can I continue working here? I wanted to just quit. I wanted to just leave, because I just felt so embarrassed. And he looked me in the eye and he grabbed my shoulder and he said, listen to me. That program may have been your foot in the door, but it is not the reason that you are here. So get back down to that newsroom, show up, and show them what you can do. And that was it. And he's like, get back out there, go.
So, okay. So now you had to, I'm guessing from, you had to show up, like all caps. Is that right? Can I ask you, I want to freeze frame. Let's freeze frame that moment. So he gives you this advice, right? This is what you're describing, whether it's a diversity hire or for many of us, we're the only person, the only one in a room, the only one in medical school, the only one in law school. And at some point, somebody gives us advice like that, which has pros and cons to it. It is not invalid advice. I had a conversation with one of my lawyer friends who said, basically any Black person who's in a top boardroom or somewhere in this country has had to make sacrifices as far as, coming to work as their authentic self or bringing their authentic self in this day and age, if you climbed during that period of time. On our podcast early on, our first episode, I interviewed Ritu Basin. So she's an EDI consultant as well. And we talked about yes. So we talked about the performative self and the authentic self and how we dance between those. She calls it a playful space, but sometimes it can be a space of a lot of angst between being able to be your full authentic self and bring yourself and all of your cultural nuances, your racialized experiences, everything, and everything else in your identities, feminine, everything that you come with, versus the performative self where you work to fit in, which is different than belonging. So now as a DEI consultant, I'd like to ask, looking back, let's do the internal and the external, because that's usually where the conflict is for many of us. Internally, I want to know, what price did you pay emotionally from having to do that performative self? And then we'll talk about what the benefits were externally, because oftentimes there are benefits from engaging in that performative versus authentic self. So let's think about that version of you. How were you feeling when you decided to show up, but you had to be your performative self to fit into a white dominant society? What did that do inside?
That question, yeah. I have to tell you that question is very triggering for me, because it brings me back to what I was feeling in that moment. And in that moment, what I was feeling was, okay, what do I have to do in order to be successful here? And I looked around, and what I tried to do was to be as least of myself as possible and as much as like them, as white as possible in every way. And so I laughed at whatever they laughed at, even racially offensive jokes. I would laugh and pretend like, like, oh, that's so funny. I would get angry at what if they were angry about something. I'd be like, yeah, that of course, that's ridiculous. Yeah, we shouldn't have to do that. There was one time when this American consulting firm came in and we were talking about diversity, and they said they looked at our streeters. A streeter, for people who don't know, is when you look on the news and you see the newscasters, the news reporters rather, going on the street and just asking random people questions. They said we need to be intentional about getting different races in those pieces. And everyone was like, well, that's ridiculous. Like, it's so hard to get streeters already. Now we need to make sure we have a Black person, an Asian person, or this person. And I would just chime in along with whatever they were thinking. I would chime in. I got 22-inch extensions in my hair. I wanted to be as much like them as I could, because I felt that that's what I needed to do in order to get ahead. But
Can I ask you?
inside, it was
Okay, what was going
eating
on
me
inside?
inside.
Because you are part of your superpower that you talked about is you are a storyteller and you believe
Yep.
in truth. And in that moment, you had to swallow your truth. So that
100%.
emotionally and physically can take a toll. So what was that like for that 23,
Yeah.
24-year-old you?
It's interesting because a lot of this I'm processing while looking back. And I honestly don't even think that I knew what I was doing to myself at the time. What the price I realize I pay now is in the growth, in the lost time of connecting with my community. I rejected everything Black. I wouldn't pitch Black stories. I wouldn't attend any type of like events or anything like in our community. I tried to distance myself as much as possible because I thought if I pitch Black stories, then they're going to pigeonhole me and I'm going to be known as that girl who does this. And no, like I'm going to be Christian Amanpour. Like that's my goal. And I can't get there by doing these type of stories. And that it hurts me.
It hurts. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Sometimes we don't realize it's just grinding at the spirit and we don't really fully realize. It's like you lose little pieces of yourself every day and it's not like boom,
Yeah.
it happens all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And so you had to so having grown up in the Caribbean where you were immersed in community, now you felt like you had to distance yourself. And so again, that professor gave you that advice. Where do you feel like there were also benefits? Because that is a common advice that we do hold, that we must fit in. And so where you were striving to fit in and you showed up, were there benefits to that?
I think that it gave me, I would like to say that pep talk changed my life. But the truth is, it really took me years to get my self-worth back.
Pause. Being the token minority contributes to the phenomenon known as minority stress. Being the only one means your values and identity are often at odds with the dominant group. It can eat at you slowly but surely over time, putting your physical and mental health at risk. So what can be done about tokenism and minority stress? Well, aside from personal resilience strategies to deal with this, another solution is the concept of critical mass. Basically, that's the theory that minorities are more likely to feel safe and have more impact in the classroom or the boardroom when they are larger in number. This is why some companies are doing cluster hires, and some schools are creating special recruitment programs. They're bringing on minoritized people in larger groups or clusters in the hopes of creating a more inclusive environment.
I would like to say that pep talk changed my life. But the truth is, it really took me years to get my self-worth back. The benefit though is that it gave me that shake it off and keep going. And that's a survivalist. That's not a thrive. That's not thrive mode, right? That's survivalist mode. And when you continue in survival mode, you eventually will crash. I've been reading this fantastic book that everyone should read called The Body Keeps the Score.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who's into psychology or into self-healing would have read this book. And it's really stunned me into realizing how much trauma, how much things that you internalize, how that affects you physically. And how when you're in a constant survival mode, you're not showing up as your best self because you're constantly self-critiquing, you're constantly filtering, you're constantly thinking, if I say this, what will they think? And that doesn't allow you to show up authentically. That doesn't bring your best ideas to the table. My best ideas came to the table once I left that situation. And that was in Ottawa, and I came to Toronto. And in Toronto, I felt immediately at home again because this is where I spent the first part of my childhood, right? And it felt most like home because I would walk down the street and hear Trini accents and hear Jamaican accents. And I was like, yeah, this is where I need to be. And that alone gave me a boost of confidence. And that allowed me over the next couple of years to get a lot more bold in my choices in the newsroom. And I transformed from someone who rejected all things Black to someone who embraced all things Black, literally doing a complete, is that a 180?
180. It's a 180.
Whatever it is.
People like to say 360, but it brings you right back to where you were. It's a 180.
So, there was just a moment I had when I thought to myself, I looked around the room and I'm like, hang on, there's literally two of us here. And
two of us,
if
like
one
Black
of
people
us isn't pitching Black people,
mm-hmm.
and if one of us isn't pitching these stories, who will? And I was like, cool. Make me that girl. That's fine. Yes, here I come. And here I come with my Blackity Black stories again. Okay, yes, I'm here and you're going to listen to it. Because I started to realize that there are so many Black Canadian stories that weren't being told because of this bias. And it's the whole reason my husband and I started ByBlacks.com. We started our own media platform because we wanted to showcase these stories.
And I want to ask you about that because, yes, that's a full 180. Going from somebody who in the newsroom doesn't speak about, Black issues, and then creating ByBlacks.com, which is all about Black news.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, for some of us, there's a number of different moments, right? So, I also, like, my weave was not as long as yours, but definitely in medical school. You know what I mean? To that need to fit in and that sense of not, feeling like you belong because if the environment isn't, inclusive. Pause. To be clear, I do wear weave and wigs and all kind of Afro-inspired extensions. You can wear weave without trying to fit into a Eurocentric standard of beauty. Hair extensions can actually be traced back to Africa and predates the colonial period. It's a form of personal expression, fashion, and beauty. And if you ask me if the hair I'm wearing is mine, I will tell you, yes, it is. 'Cause I bought it. I bought my shoes, my nails, my clothes, my hair. All mine. So no shade to my sisters wearing weave right now. I'm just saying if you do that inner work to feel good about yourself and be true to your ancestry, then your weave will look even better when you rock it in the street. My weave was not as long as yours, but definitely in medical school. You know what I mean? To that need to fit in and that sense of not, feeling like you belong because if the environment isn't, inclusive. Now, we all have different experiences. And so my understanding is you did have a racist experience that also kind of um, made it clear that regardless of the length of the weave, um,
Mm-hmm.
it's a different story for us as Black women. Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about that? And then we'll jump into
Before
BuyBlacks.com.
before I left Ottawa, I remember going to the hairdresser on Bank Street, getting my hair done, getting that 22-inch weave, walking out onto the street and really feeling myself, walking down the street, and a white man, is walking towards me. And as he passes me, looks me straight in the face and says, "You nigger bitch." And I was stunned that I looked around and no one said anything, that he just continued walking. And in that moment, it definitely hit me that, girl, no matter what you do, you're Black and you're a woman. You can't change that.
And so you embraced that.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yep.
realizing that whole issue of struggling to fit in, struggling to look like, struggle, but there's so much greatness within you. And, I know that you
Absolutely.
worked in mainstream journalism for a long time, but having those experiences of knowing, no matter what, this is who I am, this is what I bring. So I know, or from my understanding, BuyBlacks.com, as you said, was your husband's idea, but was it kind
Yeah.
of all of these different experiences that, because people come with ideas all the time. I mean, I presume not every idea your husband comes with, you're going to go with, but something about that, I suppose, resonated with you. So what was it that made you say,
Absolutely.
like, yeah, we need to do BuyBlacks.com?
Yeah. The idea was first as a business directory. And I was like, okay, cool, run with that. That's awesome. And then a friend of ours said, well, hang on, you got to give people a reason to come back to this website. Why don't you tell stories about those business people? And I was like, oh, now I'm interested. Okay. And then it was just natural, given my journalistic experience, for me to come on as editor in chief to build out that side of the business. So that's how we came together with that idea.
I see. Okay. And was there something about it that made you feel like this is what we need to do? Like, Canada
It
needs
was
this. What?
my, yes, it was having already now been working in mainstream media for six, I think by then it was six years. I really had a front row seat to how the Black community is covered. And it's either you're an exception, you're Oprah, you're Michael Jordan, or it's our mugshot that's being seen. And there's no in between. And we knew that that was not reality. Our reality was that we know loads of people and have loads of friends that are doing amazing things with their lives. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, doing amazing things rather, who you will see get covered on mainstream media if they're white.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're any other race, no, you have to do something exceptional in order to get media coverage,
Correct.
right? And we're like, no, we want to cover that middle ground. And so that's certainly what keeps driving me today, to keep covering these stories, because they deserve to be told.
And exactly, representation matters, right? Like, young people need to see it. Older people, everybody needs to see themselves reflected in positive stories and success, but we don't see that as Black people, and for many other racialized and marginalized group. But I would say specifically in this context, talking about Black people, we see ourselves represented in really negative ways, and that impacts biases, right?
It does. And I'll tell you the experience that I had in the newsroom. I loved working there. It was so fast paced, to put it that way. And, it's a 24-hour news station. So we have a lot of content, right? So it shouldn't surprise anyone the reason why we have so much crime content on 24-hour news channels is because they just need content. And I was in the newsroom working a late shift once. And at that time, there was no receptionist. So people who call in from the public, they just get us. You get the writer's desk, right? And so I pick up the phone, and I think it was 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And this guy on the other line says, you did a story about my brother. You put his picture on TV over and over again because he was accused of a crime. But he was innocent and he was exonerated. are you going to do a follow-up story about the fact that he's innocent? And I just did a hard swallow because I didn't know how to respond, because I knew, number one, that we weren't going to do a follow-up story, because that's not what we do. We rinse and repeat. We put on TV whatever the cops give us, whatever story the cops give us, whatever mugshots the cop give us. That's what we put on TV. We don't do any extra research. We're just writers. We just take that information, we slap it up on the screen. And that guy's face is everywhere. And we can't take that back. And I started to realize we treat people like they're disposable. We don't treat people as if they have siblings, that they have parents who are all impacted by this 30-second clip being replayed over and over in this one day.
And that's robbing that person of their humanity. They become this label. And in this context, you're saying mislabeled. And we know that happens throughout, North America and the Western world. We know that, black faces and black mugshots on newspapers and things like that, at least I don't know about the recent data, but very recent historically, actually gets people, like people will buy, or, those show cops and all of these things. They would overrepresent Black crime. So there's a lot of literature on that. And yeah, that has impacts. That has impacts on the biases in mainstream society, but it also has impacts in our own community when, young kids see themselves represented in that way.
You don't even have to go to studies and literature, because it's still happening now. Like, I keep a little doc where I put copies of things that I see in media is still doing now, just for reference sake, because it comes up and then they delete it. There was a story about a mother in Australia, I believe it was, who murdered her own children. And this was a big news story, of course, because of how heinous it was. The article on Twitter, they put a photo of the nanny, who happened to be Black. A photo of the nanny with the headline, "Mother kills children," something like that. And it went semi-viral before they had a chance to take it down, because people called them out on it immediately. And they're like, why are you putting a picture of the Black nanny? The story is, the nanny was talking about how much she misses them, and which is a valid story, but change the headline, right?
Pause. According to a report by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, structural racism in the Canadian press is rampant, but there is also strong resistance to addressing it. The authors noted similar patterns in the UK, the US, the Netherlands, and Australia, but they focused their study on Canada and noted people of color are underrepresented and largely invisible in the Canadian media. When people of color do appear in media coverage, they are often misrepresented and stereotyped. And despite the claims of objectivity and neutrality by journalists, editors, and publishers, their individual and organizational beliefs, values, and interests impact the news that is being produced. Overall, the authors noted, and I quote, "While the press feels free to critique other institutions, they are resistant to criticism of their own standards and practices." End quote.
Why are you putting a picture of the Black nanny? The story is, the nanny was talking about how much she misses them, and which is a valid story, but change the headline.
And that's it. So as I think this generation, and particularly after the murder of George Floyd, there is now the need to the opportunity, because of social media, to call out these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a need for institutions to do better, right? For media, for education, for all of these areas to do better. Status quo is no longer accepted. And that's been part of your own work as well, right? So now as an EDI consultant, that has been, part of your work, I presume, in helping
Yes.
Organizations and institutions do better?
I try. It's certainly a challenge. And I feel the biggest challenge is not in figuring out what to do,
Mm.
but it's in the will to do it. Do you have the will to do it? It's not that they don't know, but they need someone like me to come in and be like, hey, reminder, this is what you need to do, and here's why.
And I think there's so many, I mean, what you experienced as the diversity hire where no one told you, I think is different than like now. I think now there are institutions that are trying to create, more diversity, and people who are given the opportunities are a little bit more aware that they are being brought on because there's a need for diversity. But
Sure.
often the institution is not positioned to make it an inclusive environment. So right now in medicine, what
Agree.
we're going through, we're saying, yes, definitely we want to see more Black medical students. We want that outreach. We want, that greater equity and diversity. But when those students come into the institution, it is actually unethical if you are continuing status quo and not making it an inclusive environment. So
100%.
given what you went through, it was a different time around diversity hires. Like, again, that's very odd that, nobody told you, and I can understand how triggering that would be. But what would you recommend, I guess, maybe to both groups? Like, if somebody now is in a position where they're intentionally a diversity hire, or they're a student and part of a diversity program, what would you recommend now when you enter that space? And there is going to be that, what you described, like that feeling is going to be the same around self-worth, around why am I here, at looking at the walls and seeing all of the usually, older cis white gentlemen down the hallway who have occupied that space and led that space for so long. What would be your advice to them? And what would be your advice to the institutions? So let's start with the person who has to enter that space. What is your advice? What should they do?
I am still very much in support of diversity hiring, as we want to call it, because I think that these programs do make a difference. They do matter. And for someone going into that program, the first thing I would say is a reality check: is be prepared. That it's you, just because you've got in there doesn't mean that you're safe. Doesn't mean that you're not going to face racism and discrimination. So be prepared. Be prepared with your support network. That's, to me, the most important thing. Having people around you that you can talk to about this, that can validate what you're feeling, so that you don't end up feeling like, wait, this is all in my head. Because that's the first thing that you'll face.
Pause. Hey, you listening? Let me sound like my mom now. You listening? She said, be prepared. If you're going to be in a space where you are the only one, whether that's the token Black person, token BIPOC person, or other identity, she's saying, be prepared. And as a doctor, I fully support that. This is one hard pill to swallow, I know. Yes, we talk about what institutions should do, and they should do better. But even if they're doing that work, it might not be at a pace that is fast enough for you. So the reality is that these environments can be harmful to you. If you have to enter a toxic environment, come with your gas mask on. Be intentional about strengthening your social supports outside that space, and prepare yourself so you can come out of there with your dignity and your health intact.
That's, to me, the most important thing. Having people around you that you can talk to about this, that can validate what you're feeling, so that you don't end up feeling like, wait, this is all in my head. Because that's the first thing that you'll face. In terms of the institutions, what I always say is to resist the urge to do quick and easy hiring. Resist the urge to sprinkle Blackness around your office.
I love that image. Sprinkle. Yes, go on.
Because it's easy, right?
Yes.
Instead, focus first on dismantling the reasons why you would have pushback against bringing in more diverse candidates. First, get the people who already exist either on board or out, right? On board with this or out.
Yes. Please say it again. Please just repeat that.
The existing employees you have need to be on board or need to get out. You can't have both because you can have mandates as much as you want. You could do equitable hiring as much as you want, but those people will leave as quickly as you hire them if you bring them into an environment where they are tokenized, where they are not included, where they are ridiculed, where they are othered. So we can't just be bringing people, opening the gates and being like, hey, all right, everyone in, we're good to go now. And you throw them up on your website, on your social media, and everyone's patting themselves on the back. It doesn't work that way.
I love that. Like they need to get on board or they need to get out. And that's really about the shift in culture, right? And that happens with a lot of change management, right? It's simply that, what you're saying is actually very common in corporate culture. But when it comes to anti-racism work or anti-oppression work, it seems to be like something people just can't figure out. But wherever there's that change that is required in culture to do better, that is a common practice because you need to change the culture in the organization. I mean, thinking about you when you were that, 23-year-old and everything, yes, you showed up, yes, you performed, but you did all that with one hand behind your back, right? Because you were tied up in the fact that they wouldn't let you bring your full self, right? So imagine, like you mentioned that time lost, but I think it's a beautiful thing that you were able to go 180. So you more than made up for that time. And so, now we have buyblacks.com and you're creating transformation in the corporate world. So I think in this conversation, there has been so much to learn. And I hope that, our listeners really enjoyed going on that journey with you and that transformation and that self-actualization to transform yourself, but then you use that to transform others and then institutions. So we're coming closer to the end. And so I always like to ask, because I was in a panel and we were talking about, being Black is a full-time job by itself, right? There's just so much to carry, but so much joy with it. And so I wanted to know what brings you joy, Camille?
That's a great question that my therapist recently asked me. And I told her putting my bare feet in the grass in the backyard. And she asked me, do you feel you do that enough? And I said, no. So not only do we have to figure out what our joy is, but we got to actually do it. Hearing my children laugh, hearing them run up in their footsteps, run up and down the stairs, as annoying as they can get, that brings me joy. Just hearing that noise when I open the door and they fly through the door with their arms open and run up and hug me around the neck, that brings me the most joy. So I'm trying to commit to doing more of those things that bring me joy. Just standing still in the backyard, facing the sun in my bare feet.
I think that's such a beautiful image to leave us with. And yes, we have to be intentional about finding what brings us joy. And we definitely have to be intentional about seeking it and making it a part of our day, our week, our month, our year. Because as you know, in one of our other podcasts, we talked about joy is our birthright, right?
Apart from it being our right, our birthright, it's also a responsibility to our ancestors who were robbed of any joy. I always think about that. I always think that not only succeeding, but being happy is my responsibility. It's the way that I honor them because they that was stolen from them. So I have to carry that. I have to be happy.
I absolutely love that. I've not heard that before, but I've heard about like rest being reparations. So I'm going to add joy to
Mm,
that too, right? They were robbed that, and we
yes.
definitely deserve it to honor their memory, their experiences of colonization and or slavery, and understand that yes, they look upon us, and we must rest, we must have joy, and continue to move towards change. So, Camille, I thank you so much for being my guest on Race, Health, and Happiness.
Dr. O, thank you for having me.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast was created by Dr.Onye, and she's our host. The show is produced, edited, and engineered by yours truly, Dr. Carl Cabasel. Our technical producer is Obadiah George. Our showrunner is Cam, and JL Joseph is associate producer. Promotions coordinator is Jordan Gibson. Social media coordinator is Efwa Mfojo. And Javiera Gutierrez Duran is our logistics coordinator. Awit Siem is our business manager, and Tamika E. Latibaudiere is our research consultant. Additional support from Latoya Powell, our special production consultant. The RHH theme song is composed and performed by Gold Keys. That's Gold Keys, all one word, ending with a Z. And graphic design is handled by Veronica Ng. Do you have questions, feedback, ideas to share? We would love to hear from you. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at RaceHealth&Happy, and check out the show notes for research that was referenced in this episode, as well as other bonus material. Our website is RaceHealth&Happiness.com. Thank you for listening to Race, Health, and Happiness, and please subscribe to us anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. I'm Dr. Carl Cabasel, and we'll talk with you soon.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is brought to you with support from subscribers and listeners like you. Join us on our journey to overcome obstacles of racism while staying happy and healthy. Donate today at patreon.com/RaceHealth&Happy. Thank you for your support, and remember, it's not enough to survive in a racialized world. We are learning together to thrive.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is produced with support from United Way Greater Toronto, whose network of agencies and initiatives in neighborhoods across the Greater Toronto area works to ensure that everyone has access to the programs and services they need to thrive today. United Way is mobilizing to tackle the unignorable issues linked to poverty.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is made better by the skills, knowledge, and creative passion of the journalism students who work right here on the show. These students join us from University X, the school formerly known as Ryerson. Thank you for the hard work. We appreciate you.